I was saying to my wife this past week that I've never been in Toronto in July. It's true. Normally, July is a famous month for rabbis to go on vacation, but as work would have it, some duties and responsibilities took me out of Toronto for June. I was teaching in Berlin. I had 2 weddings in Europe as well, and so I wasn't here very much. And so we got back on the 3rd of July, and we're in Toronto for July, and it's very nice, and it's very quiet. That having been said, while Toronto might be quiet, it certainly wasn't in the Jewish world a quiet week. And in particular, there's an expression in Hebrew, for those of a certain age will appreciate that in Israel there was a time in order to make a phone call in a phone booth, everyone's nodding their head, you had to use a token called an asimon, right? And you'd have to, and then it enabled them to not have to recalibrate because of the rampant inflation, not having to recalibrate how much coin it would take to make a phone call. They could just charge you more for the token, right? That's how they were able to circumvent the problem. So in Hebrew, there's an expression, it says, nafala asimon, that the token has fallen, so to speak, right? That speaking that there are moments that have a weight and a decisiveness to it. And so this week had a very decisive feeling. Not just the terrible event that took place with the drone in Tel Aviv, but also just before Shabbat, where the International Court of Justice ruled that the Israeli territories in the presence of Israel, both in East Jerusalem and in what they call the territories, is illegal according to international law. It's interesting to note, before we talk about the territories, it's interesting to note, I think, 2 outstanding things. One, that on the 19th of June in 1967, less than 2 weeks after the breakout of the Six-Day War, and certainly about a week, roughly a week after the war had concluded, there are minutes of recorded cabinet meetings in the Israeli government where they had agreed. There was disputes and disagreements, but they had agreed, and it was an official cabinet decision that to put the territory, so to speak, on the market in exchange for a normalized peace agreement with Jordan. As Moshe Dayan later on wrote, King Hussein didn't pick up the phone. Part of the reason why King Hussein didn't pick up the phone was because about 3 weeks after that, there was the infamous meeting of the Arab League in the city of Khartoum. And in the city of Khartoum, the Arab League made their famous 3 no's. What were the 3 no's of the Arab League? No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. So, of course, King Hussein wasn't going to pick up the phone to work out a deal with the Israelis to get his territories back, because there's no way that he would be able to stand up to the pressure of the Arab League. So that said, the territories are a complicated story, and complicated in the respect from a philosophical, from an idea-based perspective. I'm not going to talk about history. I want to talk about the ideas behind these things. And from an idea perspective, they're very, very complicated. I'll give you a few ideas. After 1967, we could consider that the period that Jews and Israelis enjoyed with what generally is referred to as the territories, you can call it Judea and Samaria, you can call it the East Bank, you can call it the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, whatever your political leanings are. But let's say that from 1967, after Israel had captured those territories and reunified the city of Jerusalem, let's call that the period of Romanticism. That Israelis and Jews began to flood their way into these ancient areas that we know, certainly from archaeological and other historical remnants, that the story of the Jewish people is deeply, deeply rooted in that area. At the cities of Hebron and the cities of Shechem and Shiloh, that the old city of Jerusalem, the city of Jericho, these are ancient places that have their place in the ancient history of the Jewish people. And as the Israelis and Jews from throughout the world flooded their way in to these places, it was a romantic and magical and remarkable moment where in many deep respects, that Jews were able to come into contact with something that they had only heard about, and now they could actually see it. What shattered this romantic period of the territories that began in 1967? And by the way, you should realize that the religious Zionist movement that I'm a product of, that gave birth to some of the more extreme elements you see in Israeli politics today on the, I guess you call it the right-hand side, messianic religious moments, things like that they were ignited and fueled by the romanticism of the territories, of the expansion of the borders of Israel. For that record also, you should know that the waves of non-Jews who made their way to Israel post-1967 is of great fame. The Swedes and other Europeans who flocked into kibbutzim and moshavim, who converted to Judaism or didn't convert to Judaism, had lots of children who are Israelis today, who themselves have children, right? This was a powerful, powerful moment. And if you want to read more about it, a dear friend of mine, Yossi Klein Halevi, wrote a wonderful book called Like Dreamers. And he writes about this effect of it. And what brought an end to this romantic period, this romantic moment that began in 1967, what brought an end to it? It came to an end 20 years after that, in 1987. It's now referred to as the first intifada. The word intifada is an Arabic word that refers to throwing off control and, kind of an anti-subservient attitude, shucking off, shackles. That's called an intifada. So the first intifada breaks out in 1987, and it absolutely shatters the romantic notion of the territories, partly because what happened is that the Israelis started realizing that in this vast territory with all these ancient places that belonged to the deep story of the Jewish people lived another people. And it was a harsh awakening amongst Israelis. I'll give you one point of one polling issue, and that is post-1967, about 20% of Israelis believed that there should be a Palestinian state. After the first intifada, the number was 65%. After that moment, you can consider that another idea about the territories emerged. And if 1967 to 1987 was a period of romanticism about the territories, post the first intifada, which roughly is around 1991, 1992, post-intifada, the first intifada, begins a period of what we could refer to as the territories for peace. And emerged amongst as a swelling, powerful moment in Israel, and of course in the Jewish world too, was this idea that if the territories are returned, that peace could be had with the Palestinians and the Arab world as a whole. And so then what begins is this ongoing story that leads to the Oslo Accords, and then begins and leads into a series of other agreements. And then ultimately what occurs is that there is the second Camp David meeting. And the second Camp David summit is held in the year 2000, 24 years ago. And who's there? Yasser Arafat is there, Ehud Barak is there, Dennis Ross is there, Bill Clinton famously is there. And they try to reach, as the Oslo Accord from 1993 demands, we're trying to reach a fulsome, complete settlement of what they call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as you all know, we all painfully know, the summit didn't work. Bill Clinton was recorded as saying, he also writes about it in his autobiography. Dennis Ross, who was also there, attests to the fact that Bill Clinton said this, that when the talks had collapsed, and Yasser Arafat came over to Clinton and said, Mr. Clinton, President Clinton, you are a great man, he says to him. And Clinton looked at him. Apparently, he was sitting down in a chair. Arafat was sitting up. Arafat was a tiny guy, so he didn't have to look up that far. And Clinton looks at him and says, no, he said, I'm a failure, and it's because of you. In any event, the Camp David Accords collapse. And what emerges very, very quickly after that, but weeks actually, is what we refer to now as the Second Intifada. If the First Intifada is symbolized by Palestinians throwing rocks and spray painting on buildings messages of defiance and refusal and of anti-Semitic nature, the Second Intifada is symbolized by suicide bombers blowing themselves on Israeli buses and in hotels and in malls. So if the First Intifada brought an end to what we would call the Romantic period of the territories, the Second Intifada brought an end to the idea of peace in exchange of the territories. If the First Intifada destroyed the Israeli right, the sense that the territories could be held out of this romantic notion that it belongs to us, the Second Intifada destroyed the Israeli left. The notion that if we only gave this, that, or the other thing, that peace could be had. And the Israeli right and the Israeli left have not recovered from those two significant destructive blows to their ideology. So in the paper, when you read, oh, the Israeli left this and the Israeli, don't believe it. Because the truth of the matter is the Israeli left and the Israeli right really don't know what they stand for anymore. If the Israelis would, and it's true to say that the Israelis deeply believe that they are not in the territories to rule over another people. The Israelis are in the territories to protect themselves from another people. And that, if I could say, when you look at the story of the territories, both the Romantic period and the peace period, that we're now in the period where that the Israelis are there merely as a means to protect the people who live outside of the territories, and let's agree in what we would call Israel proper. I understand that there are people on the extremes of the left and right who would disagree with what I'm saying, but I'm speaking for this really chunky, meaty kind of middle. The 70% of Israelis and probably 90% of Jews in the world who would see it that way. Of course, this past week, when the International Court of Justice issues this opinion about the illegality of the Israeli presence in the territories, the absurdity of it is that it completely and utterly disregards any of the brief history that I've shared with you. And as a court, they have access to historians and archives and experts, people who could have come in and give them a deeply fulsome discussion and disclosure of the long-winded story, not only from 1948, but pre-1948, of Jews and Arabs, and now what we call Israelis and Palestinians, the long, sordid, painful history that has woven itself over that territory. But rather than doing that, they opted for something else. Interesting to point out that they forced the Israelis to appear in the court just before Shabbat. They didn't provide the Israelis enough time to get their own counsel because their counsel had a conflict, and they didn't delay the proceedings and force the Israelis to appear without counsel. They didn't give time for the Israelis to prepare an evidence brief either. But the truth is even deeper and a little more hurtful. Was anybody surprised at the decision? No, we weren't. And why weren't we surprised? Part of it, a large part of it, has to do with the fact that the International Court of Justice has justices who were appointed by the United Nations. And that overwhelmingly, an overwhelming majority of the member states of the United Nations are autocratic, theocratic, undemocratic countries that have some of the most abhorrent, horrible human rights records. Part of this idea about what happened this past week can be seen in a small idea from the Torah portion. In this Parshat of Balak, we read the story of Bilam. We refer to him as a non-Jewish prophet. The truth of the matter is, in the Torah text, there's no record of him being a prophet, but clearly he behaves like one. And this non-Jewish king Balak comes to him and says, I will pay you to go and curse the Israelites. And Bilam, this non-Jewish prophet says, I'm happy to take the money, but I got to ask God. And so the opening story of the Torah portion is the opening story of the Torah portion is the story of Bilam doing this song and dance. He goes, he's like, I got to talk to God. God says no. He comes back, says, I can't do it. And he goes, well, we'll give you more money. He goes, okay, let me go talk to God. He goes back and forth. And finally, God turns around and says, okay, go. Which is actually is the basis of this beautiful rabbinic idea that God lets us do what we want to do. You want to do bad, you do bad. You want to do good. You'll find the reasons and the excuses no matter what. And then in the Torah portion it says that after God gives permission, that Bilam wakes up early in the morning and he saddles his donkey by himself. And the ancient rabbis look at this tiny little detail, this verse, and what do they say? They ask, why did he run so early in the morning to saddle up his animals to head out to curse the Israelites? Because he hated them. He couldn't wait to get there. I don't presume to know what lurks in the hearts and the minds of people who sat in on the courts. It is interesting, post-Shabbat, you might want to look at the one dissenting opinion of the justice who sat on the court and her comments about the behavior of the court itself. But I don't presume to know the decisions, motivations, machinations, the emotional state of the people who sat on that court. But I can presume on some level to know by the decision that they rendered in the manner that they did, that they were rushing to arrive at a decision that they had already made in their hearts, which is a question for us that we have to struggle with. But it's a bigger question for them too. Shabbat Shalom.